Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Virtual Learning and Memory. Gonna do just a little bit on what's going on in the brain for the skill memory chapter. I think it's pretty straightforward here compared to some of the previous chapters, but I want to talk through some of the evidence that goes along with this, just in case that's a little bit tricky. So hopefully this is at least a little bit helpful. So I like this slide as you head toward the next exam, separating out declarative versus procedural memory, right? So use this to kind of think about examples. Declarative memory, like we talked about, is very flexible, right? You can pull up that kind of information really easily, and you can verbalize it, right? You can manipulate it, you can talk about it, right? Procedural memory is much harder to do that. And it's often very hard to verbalize, right? If you think about explaining to somebody how you learn to ride a bike, other than saying, well, you balance and you pedal, right? But it's easier to show somebody what it means to ride a bike, right? It's hard to verbalize those things. And the brain substrates differ, just like the behavior is a little bit different, right? So we talked about the medial temporal lobes a lot, talking about declarative memory, right? And how that often then gets stored in cortex. But for procedural skills, we're talking about the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, and maybe a little bit of cortex too, right? But those underlying structures are different, or more motor-based areas in this case, right? So the basal ganglia in particular seems to be important in forming new skill memories. So in some ways, you can think of the basal ganglia serving similar purpose to the hippocampus and medial temporal cortex for skill learning, right? In terms of learning new memories of this type, right? So we see that damage seems to impair the creation of new procedural memories, but not declarative memories. So that's what we would call a double dissociation in cognitive psychology. Medial temporal lobe damage impairs declarative formation of new memories, but not procedural. And the basal ganglia impairs formation of new procedural or skill learning, but not declarative, right? So there's a nice separation of function there. And recordings actually show that skill training produces task-relevant neural activity in the basal ganglia. So as you learn new skill training, we see changes in neural activity in the basal ganglia. And imaging studies in humans show increased activity or brain structure as well. So all of that is very interesting, right? So let's look a little bit at these. This is a really nice animal model that separates declarative and procedural learning in rats. So this is called a radial arm maze, right? We've looked at this a little bit before. It's a really common way to look at rodent memory in particular. And so on the left side here, we have an example of what the declarative learning mode of this maze would be. In this type of learning, half of the arms of this maze would have food, but there's no external markings or any way to distinguish between the different arms. There's no cues. So the rat has to basically search around and learn which arms have food, which ones they visited before, so they don't go back to that arm, right? So remembering where and when those items are, that's declarative memory, right? Procedural on the right, in this case, half the arms are lit, and those arms always have food. So the animal just has to learn that the light is associated with the food. And so that is considered to be the same as forming kind of a habit, or in that case, a skill, right? And each of these types of learning seems to be impaired by different brain lesions. And this is the data that goes along with that you saw in the book. So if we look at animals that had their basal ganglia damaged, it seems to only impair skill-based learning, right? So if we look at the right here, where we have percentage of illuminated arms chosen, right? So how often the rats in that procedural learning type of trial are choosing the arms that they should have learned are going to have food. right? And so if we look at the control group and a group that had their hippocampus lesioned, they're both performing pretty well. They're choosing that illuminated option more often. They've learned that the light equals food. But the basal ganglia group is doing really poorly, basically performing at chance level. They're not learning that association between the light and the food, right? But if we look at on the left, now we have the declarative method of learning. In this case, the basal ganglia lesion looks the same as control. They're still able to learn, right, and create that kind of mental map and time map of where that food is, right? And again, showing this nice doubled association, if we look at the rodents that had their medial temporal lobe damaged, right, they're really bad at learning that declarative skill, right? So here we're looking at the number of errors, right? And like we just mentioned, the basal ganglia group is fine, but the hippocampal lesion group is making many more errors across all of these trials, right? But the hippocampal group was fine when we looked at that skill type of learning, right? So basal ganglia damage doesn't just disrupt memory in general, it's specific to skill memory. So it's a nice contrast to what we talked about with declarative memory. And activity, like we mentioned, seems to change if we're recording from neurons as well. So this is a slightly different type of maze that we have here. Here it's called a cued T maze, and we're recording from neurons in the rodents as they're performing this task. And they're basically learning that a certain tone indicates whether they're going to turn left or right to get food on any given trial, right? So a cue is given that tells the animal which arm that they need to go down in order to get food, right? So we train them on this. Early on in training, most of the activity is happening when they're making the turn. So it's almost learning kind of the motor performance of the task. But as they get better and better, as they learn the cue and what that's going to tell them to do, this is when we start to see more task relevant activity. So when the cue happens, then we see an increase in basal ganglia firing there. And then it also fires a lot again when they make it to the goal. So really representing the connection between the cue and the goal, as opposed to early on, they're kind of just, it's more focused on the motor action of making a turn in one direction or another. So the basal ganglia activity changes as the animals get better at doing this task, right? Pretty cool. We can see this in humans as well. So this is a type of kind of cognitive skill learning. It's called a weather prediction type of task, right? So this is pretty cool. You can actually find versions of this online if you're interested in what this task looks like. Maybe I'll try and find one and post it on the discussion board. But the takeaway here is that as subjects get better on this task, we see increases in their basal ganglia activity as well. So kind of similar to the change in activity that we saw in the rodents, right? So the basal ganglia seems to be important for forming new skill memories, right? Damage impairs creation of procedural memories, but not declarative memories. The recordings that we looked at in rodents seem to suggest that the activity, as the rodents get better, gets more task specific. And human imaging studies show this increase in activity as well. So there's a lot of nice evidence there, right? But overall, the literature is a little mixed on how supportive this is, right? The basal ganglia is also really important in general in learning movements. And so the lesion effect in at least some studies could just be related to general movement problems and not specific to learning. So some studies have really tried to tease this out, but it's a little bit up in the air, right? And it's really also not clear whether the basal ganglia is involved in consolidation of skill memories, storage, or a little bit of both. And there's evidence that suggests that storage might actually happen in cortex like it does for declarative memories, right? In non-mammals, the cortex probably isn't related, right? So if we look at animals like octopi, for example, They don't necessarily show evidence that the cortex is involved in skill learning. But if we look in mammals, and a lot of this has been done in monkeys and humans in particular, that when you train on a skill-based task, whether it's a motor task or a cognitive task, right, that the cortical space involved in that type of skill seems to expand, right? So we get an increase, for example, in gray matter volume in areas related to that particular skill. Again, whether it's a motor-based skill or a cognitive-based skill, right? And so just briefly, I want to mention, right, that we see these increases in the areas that are expected, right? So this goes back to a quiz question that we talked about, right? So violinists, for example, have larger representation of their dominant playing hand in their somatosensory cortex, right? Pretty cool. Racquetball players, again, right? Dominant hand, not the hand they don't use, but the hand they do use, right? And we can see this in non-human primates as well, which is pretty cool. And there's a really cool study. I'm going to post this, I think, in the Canvas readings as well. Kind of the first human study to really look at this expansion in volume. But Dragansky has a series of papers where they look at teaching people how to juggle, and we see increased gray matter in areas of the brain that are responsible for tracking motion, right? So in terms of learning how to juggle, learning to track those balls as they're in the air is really important. So we see an increase in the gray matter associated with that, again, in task relevant brain areas with learning a skill, which is pretty cool. All right, that was probably a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but I think this stuff is really cool. And that last part is what leads into the procedural memory activity that I'm asking you to do on Canvas through Padlet. So find an example of a study that shows a change in the brain related to learning a skill. There's lots of really cool examples out there, and it gives a really nice idea of how you might see basal ganglia changes, but you also might see changes in cortex related to that skill in particular. All right. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll talk again soon.